Hi, my name's Simon Bennett. I'm the ZAP founder and project lead, and this is a series of training sessions I'm giving to the folks here at Stackhawk. In the last one, I think I said I was going to do an introduction to passive scanning, but I lied. It's changed. And what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to talk about the latest ZAP release, because we have just released ZAP 2.10.0. So without further ado, I will start sharing my screen. Okay, so if you want to get hold of ZAP 2.10.0, then you need to go to zaproxy.org/download. And you'll see, so it's linked off ZA Proxy, and then we've got the installers for Windows, Linux, Mac, and some cross-platform packages as well. And if you have a look down here, you'll see there's some release notes. And so I'm going to follow those, and I'm going to use this as a kind of a memoir for myself. And I'll make that a little bit bigger so we can. So as you'll see, this is the 10-year anniversary bug fix and enhancement release. Now, one thing I want to point out is that ZAP has a plugin architecture, and this means we can actually update existing add-ons, and we can add new add-ons at any point. So we've actually released quite a few add-ons and loads of updates since the last main release. But there's a certain part of ZAP, the ZAP core, the stuff that's defined in the ZA Proxy repo, that we can only update when we do a full release. And that is why we have the full releases, and that's the stuff I'm going to go through now. So the first thing is custom pages, and I do have ZAP running. And so this is ZAP 2.10. This is the version you can download right now. And custom pages are defined in contexts. So if you have a look at context, and some of these windows won't be particularly great size because I've got a high density display, high DPI display, and I've tweaked some of the ZAP settings so it appears bigger. And you'll see custom pages down here. So you can add custom pages manually like this, but it's a little bit of a pain. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a very quick demo. So we go to Manual Explore, and I'm going to start with budget. So keep things nice and simple. So if once budget has come up, and I just go to a random page, then we go to 404. And this is actually really good. So if we have a look down here, we will see that we get the request and the response, and it is a 404. So in this particular case, we don't need to do anything. However, there are lots of apps which have custom pages. And so they'll return a 200 or something similar, but then they'll have an error message in the page. And this is actually a real pain for automated scanners like ZAP, because it's difficult to know whether something's really not found, or whether it's an error page, or whether it's a normal response, or a response we've managed to trick the server into replying. So it's actually really useful for ZAP to know when 200s or any page that's returned with a non-error page, with a non-error code, is actually an error page. So in this case, you don't have to worry about it, but I'm going to pretend that this isn't a 404, it's actually a 200. And we will need to include budget in a context first. So I'll include it in the default context. And so you see now these things are all highlighted. Got the target on. So I'll go down and I will select this again, have a look at the response. And I've looked at the text, and we've got the requested resource is not available. A little bit of a pain because it's mentioning the resource there. So I'm going to go, the origin server did not find the current representation of the target resource. We'll highlight that, right click, and then flag as context, default context, custom page indicator. And then we go back to that dialog, but this time things have been filled in. So we've got the string we're looking for. It's in the response. It is a regex because we've got the terminating things, and I could change that to so it matched the missing page as well. It's enabled, and it's not an error page, it's a not found page, and I will confirm that. And so that's how you can configure custom pages within the ZAP UI. And all of these things are held in the configuration file. So if you want to automate those things, then have a look at the configuration file, see how they're defined in the context. So when you export the context, then when you import it, even if you're using that context in automation, especially when you're using automation, then these things will be defined. So if you have an application and it's returning 200s or similar for missing pages or error pages, then I would strongly recommend that you configure these custom pages for your application. Now, it would be great, we'd love to actually get ZAP to recognize a load of these custom pages, but that will take a lot of testing and a lot of access to applications that we don't typically have access to. So that's something which may come in the future, but we'll probably need a lot of help from everybody who is using ZAP in order to build up that kind of database of these custom pages. So that was a quick introduction to custom pages. And for those of you listening, please just shout out if you've got any questions about these things. The next thing I want to talk about is authentication polling. So authentication polling is all about authentication. And again, this is defined on a per context basis. So if we have a look at the authentication for budget here, you'll see it's manual authentication because I haven't set anything up. And this all looks very similar to before. But if I actually select something else like form-based, you'll see that previously we just had the logged in regex, logged out regex patterns. But now we have what we call a verification strategy. And the previous we didn't really have a verification strategy, but if we said we did have, then the strategy was we would check every response. So we would look for these regex patterns, whichever you defined, only in the response. Now this worked well for your traditional web applications, but it didn't work very well for modern web applications. So we've now got a whole set of verification strategies. The default will be check every response. You can check every request, which sounds a bit counterintuitive, but that can work with modern web applications, particularly if they're specifying certain headers. I've got an option to check the request or response, both of them, or this option to poll a specified URL. And this is the kind of key one, really. This is the big change, because what you can then do is you can specify the URL to poll, and you can specify again the pattern to look for, and you can say the frequency. So it could be every 60 or however many you want, requests or seconds, and you can change this obviously to whatever you want. And again, so we've got these regex patterns, and we're testing against the poll response. Then, not the request, there's no point because we know what the request will be, but you can specify poll request data and additional headers if you need to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import a context I prepared earlier. So I've got juice shop defined. So if we now have a look at juice shop, we have actually got this uses a session management script, and it's JSON-based authentication, and we'll see down here that we're actually polling this particular URL for verification. So if I now go and have a look at juice shop, we'll launch the browser. Now, because I haven't actually enabled anything, so you'll see I am not logged in, get the option to log in. And what I'll do is I will now enable this, what we call forced user mode. And I haven't really gone through authentication in a great deal of detail in any of these sessions. I've done it on some other sessions, but I will go through authentication in a lot more detail in future sessions. So I'll launch the browser again, and this may not work because it seems to happen that I need to do it twice for some reason. Let's kill that and try again, and hoping this time it will work. And there we go. So now what you'll see is we've actually got a basket, and when we look at the account, we'll see the orders, privacy, and all this stuff. Why it doesn't work the first time, I need to do some debugging. I only found that out when I was just doing some preparation for this demo. So what we've done is we have configured ZAP to understand the juice shop authentication. And in this case, we're polling a particular URL. So what I'll do is I'll go to the history, and we see down here, we've got the source of the requests. And if I scroll back far enough, you'll see juice shop does make quite a few requests. At some point, we'll see this auth. So what ZAP does is, the way I've configured it to anyway, is it makes a request to the top level. Then it performs the login, and we'll see it's using this super strong password, test123, against this particular user. And immediately after, it then does the who am I request. And we actually, ZAP will put in the authorization token, and then the response, you'll see rather than an empty user, we're actually getting back real data. So what we've done is we've configured ZAP to understand the juice shop authentication mechanism, and previously it would have tried to check every response, and most of the responses would not have had any indication whether you've logged in or not. So instead, what ZAP will do is, however often we've configured it, it will ping this who am I endpoint and check that we're still logged in. If we're not logged in, then it will log in again. So this should mean that ZAP can handle a lot more applications more effectively, the authentication of applications more effectively. And so I'll now move on to the site tree control. And in previous versions of ZAP, you had very little control over how nodes were represented in the sites tree. And as I think I explained in one of the previous sessions, that makes quite a difference to how effectively ZAP can actively scan your application. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch back to ZAP, and I'm going to load a script. And you may notice there's actually a new ZAP session. And that is because actually I had to hit a couple of problems. So I can't give the full demo, and I need to work out what's actually going on here, but I'll show the start of the demo and explain what should have happened. So I'm going to create this new script. And what this does is this script explains, it basically changes how URLs on example.com are represented. And it explains exactly how you can do these things. So you run these curl commands proxying through ZAP from the command line, and ZAP will then change them, except the second part doesn't work properly, and I'll need to investigate that. So, but I'll show you the first part. So what I'll do is run the first script, and what we should see is a couple of requests. And if you look in the sites tree, we will see that the requests are basically shown in full. And this means that ZAP hasn't really understood things. You can see it most obviously in the post request, because you see the whole request there, or as much as ZAP will show you. And in this particular case, we've got this kind of structure here, key value pair structure. And ZAP doesn't understand this. And this is a pain, because as ZAP doesn't understand this, it will try and attack the whole post payload at once, and the same with the get parameters. It won't understand that there are particular values in here that it can attack. It will just have to attack the whole thing. And that means it probably won't be as effective. But what we can do is we can use input vector scripts to actually help ZAP understand this format. And that's what this particular script does. And this script would have worked at previous versions of ZAP, but this actually changes the sites tree as well at this version. So if I have a look at the script, we will see that it parses parameters, and I will go through these in more detail in a future session, because I haven't got onto active scanning yet. But one thing, if you've used input vector scripts before, that will be familiar, but the things you won't have seen are these get leaf name and get tree path parameter functions. If you've got existing input vector scripts, then you don't have to worry about these, you don't need them, but if they're provided, then they change how leaves and or how nodes are represented in the tree. So I will enable this script and then run the first part again, and we'll now see that we have these nodes. And in this particular case, we'll see that instead of having the full information here, we just have the names of the parameters, the AA and the CC, and that means that ZAP understands that this format has two effects. One, when we start active scanning, it will be able to attack these values correctly. And secondly, if we have a load of requests and a load of different values, then we won't get loads and loads of requests in the sites tree. We'll only get one because ZAP doesn't really care about the values. It treats them all very similar. So that means that one, ZAP will be able to attack these things effectively, and two, we won't have as many nodes in the tree, so ZAP will be quicker and more effective at attacking your application. So hope that made sense. Any questions about the site tree changes?
Yeah, so I've got a question just regarding the format of changing the format from a post style to a URL style, kind of doing both of these at once, and without using scripts. So it's kind of a big question, but and I'd like to have that registered to key off on just these kind of requests. And so I've noticed that we have we've got the registering variants through the extension function for the scanner. How do we tie that to a particular type of request, I guess is the question.
So basically, I mean, it works both with parsing parameters. So it works with scripts in the same way as it does for if you've got add-ons which implement this in code. Basically, you will need to have a parse parameters function. And what you'll see here is very early on, it says in this particular script, if the URI doesn't start with the target, then return. And so what will happen is all of the input vector scripts and input vector code will get invoked for every request. So it's up to each request to look at the request and response and go, hey, I understand this or I don't. So if you don't understand it, you should exit as soon as possible. And in this particular case, we can just return. I'm pretty sure, yeah, so the code should work in a very similar way, and we can go into that when we get onto input vector scripts in the code. But what these functions do is they kind of register parameters with ZAP. So ZAP kind of tells you what the key and the value are. So this script tells ZAP what the key and the value are. If we return straight away, then we won't have told ZAP anything. So the key thing is to basically your script or your code needs to detect whether it should work against the relevant request response.
That's perfect. Thank you very much.
No problem at all. Right, any other questions about site tree modification? Okay, so I'm going to skip over the next one for a minute and then talk about authentication headers. So what we can do is we've got a nice little change where we can supply authentication headers via environmental variables. And this is particularly useful for automation. And we go to the authentication page in the help, which is also available online. It basically explains which the environmental variables are. So you have to supply, well, if you want anything to happen, you have to supply a ZAP auth header value. If you supply that, then that value will be added to every request that goes through ZAP, and by default, it will use the authorization header. If you provide a ZAP auth header value, then we'll use whatever value you specify instead of the authorization header. And those, we will add this value to all requests unless you specify a ZAP auth header site environmental variable, in which case we will only specify that value as an authorization header for sites whose name includes the value of this environmental variable. So you only have to supply that, but you may well want to supply the other two as well, depending on your situation, if that makes sense, hopefully. So next thing is SOC's proxy configuration. And again, this was something that you could do via ZAP before, but I think you had to do it from the command line, whereas now we do have think it is in here. Yeah, so we got the standard proxying, setting up the proxy, but we've now got a SOX proxy option, so you can enable that and put any information you need in there. So you could do this before but I think you had to do it on the command line, and we've now included that within ZAP. Cache scripts. Basically, I think we hit this last time when I talked about scripts. ZAP actually recompiles scripts every time, which meant they could be a little bit slow sometimes. But now with these particular type of scripts, ZAP will actually cache the scripts so that if they haven't changed, they will run very quickly. We'll use the cache version, we won't recompile them, and that means they will run as fast as Java code. So that means you should see things speed up at all if you use those type of scripts. We then have a set of add-ons, a new set of add-ons that we've included. And we've got this advanced encode decode hash dialog. Now, we already had one of those available. So if we go and look at tools, it looks exactly, well, same place, work it in the same way, but you'll see it looks different. It's got lots more features. So have a play around with that if you like. We have, this is quite a big one, a DOM XSS Scan Rule. So this is an active scan rule, and what it does, it launches browsers in order to find DOM XSS vulnerabilities. Now, because we're launching browsers, it means active scans will take longer. So if that's something that really concerns you, you might want to tune this rule down or turn it off completely. So we go back to ZAP, and I haven't gone through all these things yet, so I haven't covered active scanning, but it's actually under the client browser. This is where we've got the DOM-based cross-site scripting rule. So if you really want to turn that off, you can, or set it to a lower threshold, but it will mean that ZAP can detect DOM-based cross-site scripting much more effectively. Then the form handler, I think I mentioned this in a previous session, because this was available from the ZAP marketplace, but we're now including it by default. So if you're finding forms via the Spider Active Scanner or importing them via one of the APIs we support, and you need to supply certain types of values like emails or phone numbers in a certain format, then you can specify the default values that the spiders and importers should use in the form handler. Then we have Graal VM JavaScript. I think I mentioned this as well before. If we go to scripts and I create a new script and have a look at the script engine, script engines, you'll see that I've actually got ECMAScript, Graal.js, and Oracle Nashorn. And that is because I'm using Java 8 still. But if you're using Java 15, then you won't get Oracle Nashorn. It's not included by default. This is a pain. So that's why we've created a Graal.js add-on, which provides support for JavaScript scripting within ZAP, and that is included by default because we don't know which Java version you're going to be using. Then we've got, I'll actually mention the Retire.js rule next. So we've got a passive scan rule, and that implements most of the checks provided by Retire.js. So this will identify out-of-date or vulnerable JavaScript packages. So this is a very useful passive scan rule, and hopefully it will spot a load of things that we wouldn't have detected by default before. Then we've got GraphQL support and SOAP support. So these are two add-ons we had before, but they weren't included by default, and the SOAP add-on was actually disabled. We took it out of the marketplace because there were problems with it. But one of our core team members, Akshat, has been working really hard on these, and both of them are in such a good state that we've included them by default. And if you go to the import option file menu, you'll see we've got import a WSDL file from local file store and from URL, and import GraphQL, and we've got the Open API one there as well. So all of these imports are now included in ZAP by default. There are a whole load of add-ons that have been updated, but if you've been keeping your version of ZAP up to date, then you'll have these updates already. And there's a load of updates to the Docker images. One of the most important ones is adding support for authenticated scans, but I'll cover that in a future session. changed the bundled libraries, and we've actually got a whole load of extra enhancements and bug fixes. And you'll see we have a whole load of new API endpoints. A couple I want to point out to you, and that is we've got options to actually authenticate as a particular user and poll as a user. So this is very useful if you're automating ZAP and you want to test whether these things are working. We haven't got the, well, it's useful to test within the UI, but it's then very useful if you want to test in the ZAP daemon as well. So those particular endpoints will be very useful for you. And last but not least, I'll go back up and talk about the dynamic look and feel. So what you may have noticed is that ZAP actually does look a little bit different from previous versions. And that is because we've got a new open source look and feel that we've applied by default, and we can actually change the look and feel dynamically. So there's this little button here, dynamic switch of look and feel. And if you really want to, you can go back to the old look and feel. So you can see that's Nimbus, and we can see, go to the Mac OS. You'll see this warning here, and that's because sometimes it doesn't actually get the resizing correctly. Now, you won't actually see this normally if you're not resizing ZAP. I've kind of resized the display. But if you restart ZAP with your look and feel, it'll be fine. But this is just a very quick way to show you what things look like. And we have these two new dark mode look and feels. So if you prefer dark mode, then you can choose that one, or the flat darkular as well. So that's, and by default, it is flat white. So have a play around with those and stick with whichever one you like. And that is all I was going to go through with the ZAP release 2.10. The details are in the release notes, and if you have any problems, let us know. Great. Well, thank you very much, and I will see you next time for the next training, which we see if we can get back to passive scan rules this time. Okay, so stop that. Thank you very much. See you.